I come back to this framework of like
Yep.
of
Look, I could
operating
be
from
wrong.
a specific place, right? It's
Yes.
like so you as a person, as this person that has so much privilege and has never really had to internalize oppression the way that an oppressed community has.
Well, you don't know much about my background, so I wouldn't make presumptions.
Okay, but I'm saying the way that oppressed community has. So we live in a white supremacist society. That's just
Don't buy it. We don't live in a white supremacist society.
Okay.
No, look. If you think this is a white
argument?
supremacist society, you should read some history.
Can I just finish my?
I don't have just social justice activists, the self-appointed representatives of people who they can't even name. They don't know who they're talking about, but they've decided, right, these people are black and therefore we must share a bunch of interests. And I mean, it's like Hitchens was saying. Yeah,
it's racism. It's racism perfectly defined. It's like there are black people. They're all the same.
Yeah.
I'm a black person. I'm just like them. I can say what black people think, and you should listen to me because all black people are like that.
Yeah.
It's like exactly what a racist says. Is all those black people, they're all the same.
Yeah, it's
like,
exactly
well,
as Hitchens
no,
said.
They're not.
It's a lack of discrimination between these individuals. You know, that's exactly the point.
There's some things about this that we really have to take seriously, and this is where some of the uglier elements of science become germane. So IQ is a particularly ugly aspect of science because the IQ literature reveals that which no one would want to be the case, which is that there are profound and virtually irremediable differences in people's cognitive performance, and that those differences have a very solid biological and heritable basis. No one wants to hear that. They don't want to hear that it's biological. They don't want to hear that it's heritable. They don't want to hear it's permanent. They don't want to hear that it's irremediable and that it actually has a practical consequence. And no wonder they don't want to hear it.
Well, and even worse, they don't want to hear that it differs between genders and ethnicities. That is, to me, one of the most painful things that I've ever learned in my life is this kind of information. It is one of the great heartbreaks when it comes to the dream of pure egalitarianism. And that is, I think, even harder. It's an even harder pill for people to swallow.
After conducting the largest test of its kind, a group of scientists have concluded that IQ tests are not a fair standard for determining intelligence. A team led by researchers from the University of Western Ontario found that a single number doesn't accurately represent a person's intelligence. The group said 3 components must be studied to get a full picture of someone's faculties: short-term memory, reasoning, and a verbal component. Using special imaging, the scientists were able to show that those 3 abilities run on different circuits in the brain. The findings, which were published in the science journal Neuron, were based on the 100,000 people who participated in the experiment. The researchers also noted that regular game playing helped with short-term memory and reasoning, while smokers performed poorly on short-term memory and the verbal component. Hoping to bolster their sample size even more, researchers will continue the varied IQ tests on a web platform open to people around the world.
People talk about the fact that black people score 15 points less than white people. What do you think of this kind of numbering?
It's a fact whose meaning is totally unclear and whose existence doesn't in any sense specify the cause. Take the black-white difference in America, which is an average of 15 points, which is 1 standard deviation. By definition, the test is standardized so that 15 points will be a standard deviation. That's true. I mean, nobody denies that. The issue has never been that. The issue has been why. And the existence just doesn't tell you anything about why. The existence of the 15-point difference is thoroughly consistent with the 2 utterly extreme interpretations, namely nature and nurture. That is, in principle, it could be so. I don't think it is. That the difference is due to inborn capacities that vary between the races. And the other obvious explanation is that the difference is due to the enormous social disadvantages that the legacy and history of racism continues to impose upon the lives of black people in the United States. Either explanation would equally well account for the difference. So it is a fact whose meaning is totally unspecified by the existence of the fact itself.
Why do you think American society is so obsessed with IQ?
I don't know that we're obsessed by it, but I think it arises largely in the context of the lamentable history of our racism. I don't know that it's as much an issue in more homogeneous societies, but we have a situation based on the legacy of racism and continued oppression of people of African descent in this country that has led, for social reasons, to poor average performance of blacks on these tests. That doesn't tell you why it happens, but in a basically racist climate in a country with a strong racist history, I suppose it's not surprising that particularly conservative social thinkers would try to relate poor performance of blacks to intrinsic biological limits.
So are you trying to say that measuring IQ is used here as an instrument for racism?
It has been in the past. I don't think it's much used that way now. In fact, I'm not sure that IQ in the old-fashioned sense is much measured by mental testers at all today, except if you read Ernstein and Murray's bell curve. Clearly these data still exist. I just didn't think that many people granted that number much meaning anymore. As I like to put it, the quick critique of the bell curve is that it's based upon 4 assumptions, all of which have to be true. If any one of them is false, the whole argument collapses. First, there has to be a meaningful single number that can be given to intelligence, and I think that's false. Secondly, you have to be able to rank people in a single linear order upon it, and that order has to then correlate with social attributes, whether you go to prison or not, whether you have children out of wedlock, etc., your income. Thirdly, that number has to be highly heritable. And fourthly, it has to be unchangeable, or effectively unchangeable. A lot of people confuse the third and the fourth. They assume that if something's heritable, it means it's unchangeable, but that's false. Suppose the first 3 were true, and they're not. I mean, suppose there was a legitimate number, and you could rank people, and it was highly hereditary. It still could be very mutable. For example, the obvious example is I may have an inherited defect of vision, which is 100% inherited, and I go to the drugstore and I buy a pair of eyeglasses and my vision is fine. I mean, it could be, all those things could be true about intelligence, but the equivalent of buying the pair of eyeglasses, namely programs of remedial education, might boost IQ, and then the whole argument would collapse.
Then how do you feel about testing children to see what would be the best school for them to go to?
Depends on what you want to use it for. Again, if you look at Binet's original intentions in setting up the IQ test in 1905, 1906, when he did the first ones, you see, Binet was a French psychologist, and he was commissioned by the Commissioner of Education in France to devise a test to find students who needed help. And that's why he did the test. And his motives were entirely benevolent. In fact, he specifically argued against giving a hereditary interpretation because he understood that if you did that, you would misinterpret the number as a limit rather than an aid. He wanted to use the number as an aid to identify children who needed help so that they could be given help. And everything could be done for them. Whereas if you give a hereditary interpretation, then you identify a low score with people who can't be helped. The exact opposite occurs. You invert the original purpose. So as long as Binet's original purposes are honored, the tests can be used benevolently, and sometimes they are. For example, tests are used usefully to help identify people who have specific difficulties like dyslexia or autism or other forms of disability in learning, and there's nothing wrong with that. The human mind just doesn't work very well with certain questions. We're very bad at probability. We're always making these dichotomous divisions of things into two. One of the things we're very bad at is when we're faced with something that's very complex, as intelligence is, because it involves lots of different independent abilities, the relationship between hereditary and environment, and all these complex questions, we have this terrible tendency to try and make things simple, try and get a single number. There's a whole history in subject after subject of trying to encompass complex and independent attributes with a single number. My colleague Medawar, for example, once wrote a very interesting article showing how in soil science, in this totally different field, people for decades got hung up on trying to get a single number to measure the quality of soil. Now, how can you do that? There's no such thing as the quality of soil. This one is 51. This one is 76.2. There isn't. There are just different things that soils can do. The same. Now, the human mind is even more complex. There is no number that can capture the quality of mind, and it's almost humorous to think that there is. But unfortunately, the assumption that we can do such a thing, tied to the use of such theories by conservative social ideologies, has had profoundly negative consequences for the lives of millions of people. There are millions of people, particularly in this country, who've been told they can't do this, who've been denied admission to this or that program on the basis of a number, which was falsely interpreted as representing an intrinsic limit upon them based on their biology, but was in fact only a measure of social influences upon their lives. So unfortunately, it's not funny when it's had such tragic consequences. And that's, of course, why we are upset over the fact that the issue seems to keep coming up, because it has consequences. It hurts people.
Well, I want to say just very quickly that last night I saw this Time magazine with the front cover regarding that IQ book that you had mentioned, and I was just appalled by it.
No,
because I thought if I was
yeah.
a black man in this country, I would not know what to do with myself.
How about if you were a black woman?
O.J. Simpson.
How about a black woman? Did you read the article?
Or a black
I mean, the
woman.
article claims that one of the things it discusses is the idea that black women don't nurture their children. You know, and that's because they came from Africa where the climate was such and such. You know, I mean, this is stuff that's right out of the Nazis. You know.
It's just, I was thinking, how would I feel? You know what? I don't know what to do. I mean, it's just rage. Maybe I would wake up every day. Maybe I'd be despondent. Maybe I try to relate to other people as human beings. But inside, there would be a burning fire.
See, but I think I mean, I agree with that emotional reaction. But if you think about it, the right way to respond is to ask, what are they doing it for? And they're doing it for a very simple reason. Like I said last night, 40% of the kids in New York, most of them who are black and Hispanic, are living below the poverty line. That means they're destroyed. Okay. Well, you can't, and that's the result of very definite social policies which are supported by the New York Times. Okay. There are certain social policies which are driving people down to destruction. Well, you can't say that plainly. So you need some cover. Well, what's the cover? Okay, bad genes. You know, who knows? Maybe, you know. But and once you understand that, then you know how to deal with it. You know. Well, you know, it's not that their audience wants to hear that. It's that, I mean, some of it does. It's that that's the proper ideology. Just as it was proper for the Nazis at some point to say Jews are a virus that's destroying our society, it is proper for the New York Times to run articles taking seriously the idea that black mothers don't nurture their children. And like, take me, Ashkenazic Jews, we're supposed to be at the top. We have small families because that's what we're like. That's why my mother came from a family with 11 kids, you know, because Ashkenazic Jews have small families. Of course, she was an East European, you know, living in a peasant society. Maybe that had something to do with it. No, that's not what social science tells you. Okay, well, that's, you know, these things are such transparent ideological weapons that you shouldn't even bother arguing about them. We should just understand them transparently for what they are. I'm in a real commissar culture, which is dedicated to trying to obscure the most elementary truths, and therefore is able to do things like this on the front cover of the New York Times. Well, that's the world we're living in. And, you know, you can understand the emotional reaction, and it's easily understandable, but it's not the right one. Because what's going on is very transparent. This doesn't have anything to do with evil and God. This has to do with rich, powerful people trying to justify the fact that they are pursuing social policies which are forcing children to die. That's what it has to do with.